All right, guys, so here we go talking about the fifth video, the last video for chapter 25, and we're going to be talking about changes in Japan. So when we last discussed Japan back in chapter 25, it was emerging as a modern industrial power. During that period known as the Meiji Restoration, right? You got to make sure that you remember that. It decided to copy the ways of Western industrial powers like Great Britain and the United States. And the result was that Japan had become a dominant force in the Pacific. It was the only modernized industrial power in Asia. So let's talk about this rise to power that we see in Japan. In 1926, Emperor Hirohito took the throne. You can see that he ruled for a very long time, 63 years until his death in 1989. And during the early period, there's a picture of the emperor. Also notice the way that he's dressed, westernized, right? You know, he's in, I'll show you a later picture of how he's wearing the traditional robes, but he looks very similar to kind of a British monarch or the German Kaiser with the military garb and so forth, right? That was purposely done. Now, during the early period of his reign, Japan experienced tremendous economic growth. Japan was the only major industrial power that was not really involved in World War I, so Japan was able to make a ton of money by selling to the Allies. It saw modernization with railroads and electric lines and things like that. Plus, Japan had annexed Korea. Sorry about that. So, plus, Japan had annexed Korea as a colony, and it was expanding its influence all throughout Asia. You see the map here. Let me take myself down. All right, don't worry about the green during World War II because we're not up to that yet. But you see here you've got the Japanese islands. Oops, didn't mean to do that. All right. In the red, you've got the Japanese islands, and then you see how quickly it expanded. Right, 1931, Manchuria. That's going to be a very important thing we're going to be talking about later. But it, started to really go through a lot of these small little islands. But this peninsula here, okay, that is Korea, that green peninsula, and that's going to be very important. Let me just make sure that I can color here. All right, there we go. Okay, so here you see the Korean peninsula. That was taken over by them by 1910. So all this being said, in order to keep on good economic terms with other nations, such as Great Britain and the United States, Japan actually started to turn away from its imperialist policy and make significant democratic reforms. Okay, I got a little ahead of myself hitting that point there, but you see it up there on the bottom. Now, there were legit checks and balances at this time, right, to try and keep really both the emperor's power in check and all the branches of government. And all adult men, regardless of social class, were given the right to vote. Women could not, though, nor could they until 1945. Japan was still a very patriarchal society. Now, despite these positive developments, there were still several problems. One was, even though there were democratic reform, the government was still largely controlled by the Zaibatsu. Now, the Zaibatsu, remember, were these wealthy industrial families that we discussed back in chapter 25. They would make donations, which were essentially bribes to government officials, and this led to widespread corruption. So they had a lot of government officials in their pocket. Also, the prosperity did not extend to the rural peasants. The poor remained very, very poor. Also, urban workers were very, very poor. It was really only people like the Zaibatsu here, okay, the elite, that were seeing the true benefits of all this industrialization and modernization. There was also the growing issue of Western versus conservative values. In cities, the younger Japanese adopted Western styles and fashions, as you see by these two Japanese women. The fashions that they're wearing here, you'd see that in London, Paris, New York, any of these Western cities. Conservatives, especially in the military, excuse me, they condemn these movements as going against core Japanese values or values or obedience and respect for authority. Remember, that was always a very, very large part of Japanese culture, the respect for the authority. And the final problem to list here is one that Japan had very little control over, but it might have been the most significant, and it was the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression started in the U.S. in 1929 and quickly affected many countries throughout the world, including Japan. That was one of the downsides of being an industrialized power and doing business all over the world. Their fate was tied in with other countries such as the U.S. that were hit very, very hard by the Great Depression. Trade plummeted, unemployment went way up, and Japan's booming economies were brought to a standstill. Now, the combination of westernization and economic distress led to the growth of a movement known as ultranationalism. Now, ultranationalism is an extreme form of nationalism. They condemned westernization. but used European nations of an example as why they should expand their imperialist policies. Nationalists said that expansion and conquest were the only things that could get Japan out of this economic crisis. They set their sights specifically in a region of northern China known as Manchuria. I mentioned that briefly on that map a couple slides back, and I said that's going to be important, and it is important now. This in turn led to what became known as the Manchurian Incident. So Manchuria is this region up here to the north of China, bordering the Soviet Union. To the north of Korea and bordering in between China and the Soviet Union. It was a region rich in natural resources necessary for industrialization like coal and iron. Plus, Japan was becoming overpopulated at this time, so the government believed they could relocate people across the sea into Manchuria. They had to gain control of it first. And they needed an excuse to do so. This excuse came with a terrorist attack on a Japanese-owned railway line in Manchuria. Terrorists, or at least it was claimed that terrorists blew up a railway line, killed a bunch of civilians and so forth. Now, this took place in Manchuria, but the Japanese military claimed that China perpetrated the attack. And in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. They used this terrorist attack as an excuse to send the troops in, and the military quickly overran Manchuria, as you can see here, by the Japanese troops with the flag of the rising sun marching through the streets of Manchuria. They eventually turned Manchuria into a puppet state, kind of the first real expansion of the Japanese empire into the Asian continent. Now, some members of the Japanese government actually condemned the attack, but the Japanese people sided with the military. They supported it. The League of Nations, now remember, that was the international peacekeeping organization created after World War I. The League of Nations condemned the attack. And in response, Japan simply left the League. They literally just got up. Here, let me erase this. All right, these are all the Japanese delegates after they had walked out of the League of Nations. You see all of their papers and all their documents walking out. The League of Nations members stood up and said, "You can't do this, you can't do this, this is bad." And they said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And the League of Nations said, "Well, if you do this, you're out." And they said, "Okay, fine, we're out." And they just walked out right then and there. It really showed how powerless the League was to enforce peace and hold back aggressive nations such as Japan. Now, aside from adding to the size of the Japanese empire, the Manchurian Incident showed that Japan was firmly under military control. By 1937, the military elite were firmly in control of Japan and made several sweeping changes. All of those democratic reforms that I talked about, well, those were thrown out the window. They suppressed democratic freedoms like freedom of speech and freedom of the press. You could no longer speak openly out against the government. It revived the old warrior values, like from the samurai days, okay? Strength, honor, but also death before dishonor, complete obedience to authority. And at the top of the authority was the emperor. So here you see Hirohito, but in his more traditional robes. This absolute obedience to the emperor was reinforced in school and popular media. Now, while Japan continued to expand in Asia, another war was breaking out in Europe. Now, seeing an opportunity, Japan decided to ally with Germany and Italy, creating the Axis powers. And this far-reaching alliance would turn World War II into a truly global war, but we'll discuss that in Chapter 28.